We are going to turn the page to some of the more controversial issues as it concerns how the issue of what's been happening vis-a-vis Palestinian struggle for liberation in the past couple months has affected the conversation about who to support, how to support them, what's right, what's wrong, and how that all looks. And for that conversation, we are very happy to be joined here by the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, Ben Becker, who is partially joining us for other reasons because he recently wrote an article called Building a Real Left, Not One That Condemns Resistance and Is Without Palestinians, which you can find on liberationnews.org. Dr. Ben Becker, thank you for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, very good to have you here. I guess my first question I'll always ask, I read the title, Building a Real Left, Not One That Condemns Resistance and Is Without Palestinians. What led you to write this article?
Yeah, well, I think that in a way we've been in a moment where we've seen mass unity on the left. And the last month and a half in particular, where we've seen people in the streets almost every single night. And I think, that's been amazing. I've been part of that. Many others I know who watch the show and organize have been part of that, seeing this truly mass anti-war movement that's growing really in defense of the Palestinian people, when it's so obvious that who the occupier is, who the aggressor is, that who the colonizer is, sort of the moral clarity has been there in these last 6 weeks, especially of bombardment, siege, genocide. But that does not mean we should forget that there was an initial period of, I would say, considerable confusion, even among people who are leftists, progressives, who theoretically and abstractly stand with Palestine in all times, especially right after October 7th, where there was sort of this thing where people were putting an equal sign between the two sides, condemning both sides, saying they support sort of the Palestinian right to resist in general. But then when it has any concreteness, they were running away from it very quickly. In particular, Naomi Klein, Michelle Goldberg, some of the leading sort of lights of left liberal politics, I would say more liberal than left. And it's not just a matter of setting the historical record straight, which I think has value in and of itself as a historian, but also I think because we could be entering a new phase of the Palestinian struggle where it's not just about one side being on the receiving end of bombs, but this could actually intensify into a more regular and intense war in which there are counteroffensive, in which other countries in the region, not to mention the Palestinians, are striking back at Israel. There could be more fighting in the West Bank. There could be more fighting in 48. And if that happens, we don't want to return to that moment of confusion where everyone runs away and says, well, all sides are bad and this is a complicated thing, and I'll stand with Palestinians only if they are committed to civil disobedience that's nonviolent, which, of course, the Palestinian people, and this is what my article goes through, have a long tradition of trying many different tactics. It's not like the October 7th was the first attempt to sort of strike back at the colonial occupation. When they went in the Great March of Return, nonviolently, they were shot down. So the people who came on October 7th really returned to the same places where their nonviolent protests of the Palestinian people had been repressed, and this time they came with arms. So I think it's important to review some of the history that we've just been through the last 2 months, because the next few months or years could be a phase of actually more intense war.
I refer to a poll here to not just back up what you're saying, but then to get your response. There's this poll by a very well-known and highly respected polling outfit. It's called the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. And it conducted this poll during the week-long pause back in early December in Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. So it's not all Palestinians, but it's a pretty good I guess thermometer is the right word of general Palestinian opinion in these places. And the majority of respondents, 81%, said they believe Hamas's attack on the October 7th was a response to longstanding Israeli attacks on Palestinians and their holy places and aimed at releasing prisoners. More importantly, the majority, 72%, believe the decision to launch the attack was the right one despite the costs. And that's actually, that goes up to 82% in Gaza and then 82% in the West Bank. and 57% in Gaza. Popularity of Hamas has gone up, with 72% saying they're satisfied with the role of Hamas right now, and then 11% saying they're satisfied with Mahmoud Abbas, who the Palestinian Authority leader that the U.S. is supporting and also trying to give control of Gaza to. But anyway, sorry, I won't ramble on too long here. I just want to get to something very, very important, which is when we're talking about the issue of Palestinians and what to support and who to support. The number supporting armed struggle in the West Bank is 68%, which has doubled in the last 2 years. And then 69% overall support a return to armed confrontations, which is up 11% from September. So, I'm just curious, Ben, after hearing some of those numbers, like, how do we take those numbers and understand them in the context of how we are supposed to be talking about Palestine on the left, given the sort of like wishy-washy stuff we saw after October 7th?
Yeah, I think these are crucial poll numbers that everyone should familiarize themselves and in a way memorize. It doesn't mean that we from outside have to say, well, if I were Palestinian, how I would have responded to each one of those poll questions. You're not obligated to support this or that party or this or that tactic inside of Palestine from the outside. But you are obligated to grapple with those numbers. You are obligated, actually, if you're a serious activist, to try to get to that question. Why is it that the support for armed struggle has gone up it's doubled in the last couple of years? Why did that happen? That's not because Palestinians are prone to violence and, just love the gun and have a, sort of a romantic view of it. These are people who have lived through the worst forms of occupation, expulsion, displacement, and genocide, and have seen that only intensify. They've seen Israeli politics move further to the right. They've seen the international community and all the sort of treaties and promises of all these types of solutions all fall by the wayside. That's why people have arrived at this. And those numbers about support for Hamas on October 7th, that, again, is not that Hamas has not always been as popular as it is right now. So we have to grapple with that. If we're serious about building a left that involves the people who are under the gun, the people who are under occupation, we have to really understand the sentiments that are driving that community. And that's why if you get up and you condemn the resistance, you condemn all the things that 70 to 80 to 90% of people are supporting, you're going to build basically a left of the West that doesn't include the Muslim and Arab community in particular, but also other colonized peoples, nationally oppressed peoples in the United States and around the world. This is the sentiment that's been growing in the global South as a whole. So the question is the left in the United States trying to build sort of a abstract and pure, politics around basically saying, well, we're against occupation in the abstract, or are we trying to actually unite with the social force, a huge section of humanity that's rising up right now? And of course, some people say, well, you can't build respectability if you in the United States or Western politics, if you speak like this. But the question is always respectability among whom? I'm for being respectable. I want our politics to be respected. But are we trying to get respectability among a tiny section of the ruling class of this country, the liberal section of the ruling class, which of course is against Palestinian liberation, no matter what tactics they take, has never put any skin in the game in defense of Palestine. In fact, has always formed a kind of like left-wing cover for Israel? Or are we trying to build respect among the broad working class of this country and of the global South? So yeah, I think that's our true audience. And that was really the point of this article I was writing. And it's something that's actually recurred in many different struggles back to Vietnam, even before Vietnam. Are we just for peace in the abstract, or do we actually believe that the Vietnamese people, have a right to their own homeland? So in the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s, this was a big debate inside the movement. Are we just for peace, or actually are we saying that the U.S. has no right to be there and that this is Vietnamese land? So actually, victory to the National Liberation Front. That became a big slogan on the left and was part of the radicalization of the 1960s and 1970s of U.S. youth. And I think a similar thing could be happening right now with this Palestine struggle.
No, I think those are all very important points and crucial to understanding this. And I mean, it also, I think, speaks in terms of an orientation perspective, at least from the United States. who is the onus on? I mean, to maybe just sort of pick up on your historical example, this is actually something that was once posed to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. about the issue of Vietnam. And people say, well, how can you support the National Liberation Front and the South Vietnamese because they're committing all these atrocities? And, they're committing all these atrocities. And, then as now, a lot of those atrocities were not real, but, it's war. I'm sure things are happening. But his response was, this is not random, that this is in fact only happening because the United States is preventing the Vietnam from emerging from colonization. So what's the point of sort of empty denunciations if you don't actually address the cause of what's actually taking place, and that is the U.S. occupation, and thus the U.S. war in that sense. And so I am going to oppose the U.S. war in Vietnam, which is the best way to actually bring peace and justice to the area. So in a way, also raising the issue that, is it also the job of people in the United States to just be, constantly telling other people what to do, as opposed to looking more specifically at the role the country they have the most influence in is playing in the conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really a U.S.-Israeli war. I mean, that we should always keep saying that Israel would not be able to do this at all were it not for the U.S. support. The last few days, Biden has been trying to put distance between himself and Netanyahu. He's trying in a way to throw Netanyahu under the bus in certain aspects of the far-right government. He understands how his support for the Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people is probably going to tank his 2024 election. So he's trying to create a narrative. So for the next 9-10 months, he can say, well, I was always trying to minimize civilian casualties. I think it's far too late for that. I don't think anyone's going to buy it, but it's what he's trying to do. And I think it's very important we not let him get away with that, and consistently emphasize that if it were not for the U.S. support for this war and support for Israel, really the occupation as a whole would collapse. And, it doesn't, we're not saying that, again, if you were Palestinian, how you would have to vote in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. But we should point out this particular fact, that Hamas is obviously among the most popular party right now. Marwan Barghouti, who's from Fatah, is imprisoned in Israel. He actually is the most prominent and most popular political figure in Palestine. The Palestinian factions across the ideological spectrum have been trying to reform a national front. That's what's different from the Vietnam era, where you had the National Liberation Front, which obviously represented all the national liberation forces. There's been a conscious effort from the U.S. and from Israel to keep the Palestinian people divided, keep the Palestinian factions divided. And is it our place in the United States to pick and choose which Palestinian group is valid, which one is credible, which one needs to leave the country? That's the new thing. How are we going to get Hamas to leave Gaza? How is that the U.S.'s role? I mean, that's worse than the world policeman. You're actually going to try to displace the most popular party in a area and try to make it leave the whole country. I mean, what gives the U.S. the right to do that? Imagine if another country were to say, well, given the threat that Joe Biden has posed to the whole world, or Donald Trump or Barack Obama has posed, we actually think the Democratic Party would has to relocate its entire leadership to a different country. I mean, when you actually put the shoe on the other foot, the absurdity becomes so clear. But this is the kind of anti-imperialist consciousness that we need to be hammering away at right now. People are open to it. People are fed up. People are tired with Biden and Trump together. If there was ever a time to build independent, left-wing, socialist, anti-imperialist politics, now's the time.
Ben, I want to ask you, you mentioned before other players in the region, and there's a very real chance, though it's still less likely, it could happen that this war could spread further. I mean, it is involving, right now there's so many fronts. The main front is obviously Gaza, Palestine. That's like where the primary problem is, the primary fighting is. But you also have Lebanon, you also have Yemen, you also have the Iraqis. This is a regional issue because Israel is a problem for the region. So going back to your original point, I guess what I'm trying to ask here is how would you, I guess I'm a bit worried. Being in Lebanon, I'm a bit worried. If the front in Lebanon explodes and it opens across the country, okay, it's not Palestine anymore. It's not Hamas anymore. Now you have Hezbollah. Is it going to be denunciations of Hezbollah and condemning Lebanon? What about Yemen? You know what I mean? It's none of these groups, I think everything you're saying applies to these groups, but I just like to get your perspective on how the response should be as this war escalates and spreads and has all these different fronts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there would be a lot of confusion in the US and Western left generally among certain elements of it. And by this, I really mean, again, sort of the liberal, I feel uneasy about even sometimes calling them left. It's really people who sort of take their lead from the liberal section of the ruling class. And so they're only willing to go basically as far as they're willing to go. And we've seen this over and over. In the U.S., I was an organizer with the Answer Coalition against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And there was a section of the peace movement that wanted to just say, U.S. out of Iraq, which was good. We agreed with that. That was our main slogan. But should we bring the Palestinian issue into this? And even though the activists themselves said, well, we support Palestine, the main thing is in Congress, up on Capitol Hill, no one's for Palestine. So if we bring up Palestine, we're going to lose, some anti-war voices in Congress, and that's the most important thing. So again, they were orienting in that direction. So I think if the war were to expand even further, you'd have a lot of arguments using the same logic, where people would say, well, we're for peace. Yes, we would obviously be for peace too, peace in the Middle East. But we wouldn't join, our section of the movement would not join in the demonization of any of the countries or parties or movements that you mentioned. Because again, what they represent are authentic. They're not the only authentic, but they are an authentic representation of the political will of the people of those countries. And in this context, against Israel would really mean against US imperialism. So this would be, in fact, a wider national liberation struggle. And it wouldn't be sufficient to just say you're for peace, because peace on whose terms? Like we always say it, we want peace with justice. And I think the big threat with this, the reason why they don't want this war to expand is because it will utterly expose which governments and which regimes and states in the region are fully in the tank with the US and which ones are representing the will of the people. Because obviously the will of the people across the Arab world, the Middle East, West Asia, is with the Palestinian people. Hundreds of millions of people have no confusion about that. So if there were a wider war, I think, as you can see already, the support for Yemen goes way up because of what they've been doing. Whether or not you like it in the United States, if you're an activist, you have to know that tens of millions of people are cheering Yemen when they say they're going to have a military blockade of Israeli ships, right? And so again, it will pose the question even more sharply if there's a sort of a larger U.S.-Israeli Western war against what they're calling, what could be called the resistance axis. We can't be neutral in that. We have to say that one side represents basically the colonized people trying to overthrow now centuries of colonization and national oppression. And it would be to the advantage of justice around the whole world for U.S. imperialism to actually lose the war in the Middle East, for all U.S. troops to leave the Middle East, all the U.S. bases in the Middle East to be closed down. And we could take all those trillions of dollars that have been spent on pointless, needless wars that the peoples of those regions will never accept, and we can use that for infrastructure, for jobs, for education, for housing. Here in New York, we had a building collapse just a few days ago because the infrastructure is crumbling. So we have a whole country and a whole economy that's geared towards a war economy. It can be geared towards a peace economy. So we're going to have many different slogans if the war expands, but a key one, of course, will be we need money for jobs and education, not for war and occupation.
Very succinct, very well put. Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Pretty good outlet, if you ask me. Thank you so much, as always, for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. Great show.